They thought no one would see. A young mother and her
Yeah.
baby, left defenseless on a scorching Sunday morning. A police officer's leash pulled tight, a wounded canine snarling, trained to obey violence instead of mercy. And then, out of the crowd, he stepped forward, a former U.S. Marine carrying scars of war, with a loyal German shepherd at his side. What happened next would divide a town, break your heart, and then stitch it back together with hope. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever suffer, no animal should ever be broken for power, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The sun rose heavy over Willow Creek, Georgia, on a Sunday morning in July, and by 9 o'clock the air had already grown thick with heat. It was the kind of oppressive southern morning that made even shadows look tired, when cicadas screeched from the trees and the grass seemed to sweat beneath the sprinklers' spray. Neighbors moved slowly but visibly, men dragging out folding chairs to sit in patches of shade, women shaking rugs from porches, children running barefoot through sprinklers, and the occasional churchgoer making their way down the block in pastel clothes. The town had its rhythm, and on this particular Sunday, it seemed as though everyone had taken their places in a play they had rehearsed for decades. On the steps of a weather-worn rental sat Jasmine Brown, a young black woman of 26. Her skin, once luminous, now seemed dulled by exhaustion. Her shoulders sloped under the weight of weeks without rest. She wore a faded cotton dress that had belonged to her late mother, the hem frayed, the color washed pale. Her curls, once her pride, were tied back into a hasty bun, stray strands sticking to her damp temples. In her arms, she cradled Chloe, her 6-week-old daughter, swaddled in a thin blanket. Chloe's tiny fists fluttered against her chest, her breaths shallow but steady, her soft whimpers almost drowned by the cicadas. Jasmine hummed a lullaby her mother used to sing, one she had promised herself she would never forget. Her life had shifted so brutally, so quickly, that the quiet rocking on her porch felt surreal. A year ago, she had believed in love. She had believed in Ethan Miller, a white man whose smooth smile and confident voice promised her safety, stability, a future. But Ethan's charm had been paper thin. Beneath it had been addiction, desperation, and lies. He had drained her of her savings, pawned her jewelry, and used her name for debts she hadn't known existed. Then, when Chloe was born, he vanished. No note, no apology, just the emptiness of a man who had taken everything and left her holding a baby and a life shattered into pieces. Jasmine had hardened in the aftermath. She no longer trusted easily, her laughter had vanished, and the girl who once believed in second chances now lived with armor around her heart. But the child in her arms was her anchor. Chloe's existence was fragile, but her presence gave Jasmine a reason to rise each morning, to fight back against despair. The baby's soft breath was the thread that kept her tethered to life. Across the street, Eleanor Price watched. She was 68, a widow who had buried both a husband and a son and carried those losses in her frail frame. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and though her body stooped with age, her sharp eyes missed nothing. She sat on her porch in a pale blue house dress, a porcelain teacup trembling faintly in her thin hands. Eleanor had been a nurse for most of her life, and grief had made her both blunt and compassionate. She could see sorrow in others because she lived with it herself. This morning she saw Jasmine rocking her child and recognized the heaviness of someone fighting a battle alone. "Poor child," Eleanor murmured, though no one could hear her. "She's carrying the world on her shoulders." Farther down the street, another figure appeared. Sam Carter stepped out of his modest home with the steady gait of a man who had marched across deserts and jungles. At 40, Sam still had the build of the Marine he once was. Tall, broad-shouldered, his back straight, his jaw square. His hazel eyes, dulled by years of war, carried both weariness and watchfulness. His hair was cropped short, streaked with gray at the temples, and he walked with the quiet dignity of someone who knew both loss and survival. At his side padded Atlas, a 10-year-old German shepherd. His black and tan coat had dulled with age. His ears stood firm, though one tipped slightly now, and his movements were slower but full of purpose. His amber eyes burned with memory, reflecting years of loyalty, danger, and trust. Atlas was more than a pet. He was Sam's brother in arms. The two had served together overseas, where Atlas had been trained as a military K9. Sam could still remember the night when the name had come. They had returned from a mission that had gone horribly wrong, their unit battered and broken, and Sam sat in a dim barracks staring at the dog who had saved him once again. The German shepherd had curled beside his cot, breathing steadily, as if nothing could shake him. "You carry the world for all of us, don't you, boy?" Sam whispered. And the name Atlas had stuck. Like the Titan of old, this dog carried burdens so others didn't have to. When Sam retired, Atlas was also deemed too old for active duty. Paperwork had suggested reassignments, but Sam refused to leave him behind. He fought, filled out endless forms, and argued until they let him take Atlas home. Together they had returned to Willow Creek, two soldiers who no longer wore uniforms but bore invisible scars. As Sam walked with Atlas that Sunday, the leash hung slack between them. They no longer marched. They simply moved together in rhythm, survivors side by side. The street smelled faintly of bacon from nearby kitchens, water splashed from sprinklers onto cracked sidewalks, and cicadas filled the spaces between voices. But beneath the noise there was something heavier, a stillness that hinted at a storm not made of rain. It was as though the air itself waited, holding its breath for what was coming. Jasmine rocked her baby, Eleanor sipped her tea, Sam strolled with Atlas, and Willow Creek carried on its Sunday rituals. Ordinary moments, ordinary lives, yet beneath the weight of the morning, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. The sound arrived before the sight. A low rumble carried itself through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, bouncing off the houses and rattling the windows of porches where neighbors sat with their coffee. It was a different kind of sound than the hum of lawnmowers or the chatter of cicadas. This was sharp, purposeful, mechanical, a warning that something was coming too fast. Jasmine Brown's lullaby faltered on her lips as the noise grew louder. She clutched Chloe closer, the baby stirring at the tension in her mother's chest. The cruiser swung around the corner with more speed than the narrow street deserved, tires screeching against the sun-scorched pavement. The black and white paint reflected the July sun, and the red and blue lights flashed without sirens, creating a strobe that made the cracked sidewalks glow in pulses. The car braked hard, skidding slightly, and came to an abrupt stop in front of Jasmine's rental house, crooked against the curb. For a moment, all of Willow Creek seemed to fall silent, as if the heat itself was holding its breath. The driver's door opened with a metallic snap, and Kyle Mercer stepped out. He was 39 years old, tall and wiry, his blonde hair cropped close to his scalp as though he still measured himself by the neatness of his reflection. His pale eyes scanned the scene with a practiced coldness, sharp and deliberate. His jaw clenched as he adjusted his belt, the metallic jingle of equipment cutting through the stillness. His uniform was pressed, spotless, and stiff, an image of authority worn like armor, an extension of a man who had grown up believing that respect came only from fear. Mercer carried himself like every inch of the street belonged to him. A second sound followed, the scrape of claws against asphalt. From the back seat leapt Ranger, a German shepherd of 8 years, his coat black and tan, thick and sleek under the glaring sun. His body was still powerful, muscle built from years of training, but his movement carried an edge of unpredictability. Above his left eye, a faint scar cut through the fur, a reminder of the head injury he had suffered 2 years earlier. Ranger had once been one of the best canines in the state, praised for his obedience and control. But since that accident, something inside him had shifted. His instincts were broken, his focus fractured. Where once he hesitated, now he lunged. Where once he sought guidance, now he often acted on aggression alone. Mercer, known for his harsh hand, had only worsened the problem, molding Ranger into a tool of intimidation rather than protection. The German shepherd landed heavily beside Mercer, his amber eyes glinting beneath the light, his teeth bared in a low growl. Mercer pulled the leash tight, almost enjoying the tension of it, and the dog strained forward as though every muscle had been primed for confrontation. Neighbors who had been outside paused where they stood. A man with a mower turned off the engine. A woman halfway to her car froze with a grocery bag in her arms. From across the street, Eleanor Price's teacup rattled harder in its saucer, spilling drops onto her lap, but she did not move. She only stared, her lips pressed tight. 3 houses down, a boy emerged barefoot from his driveway, drawn by the flashing lights. Brian Keller was 14, thin and pale, with freckles scattered across his nose and hair that kept falling into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. He was known for always carrying some device in his hands, a radio half taken apart, a game console rewired, or his phone constantly buzzing with apps he was testing. Brian's world was one of screens and signals, and though many dismissed it as obsession, he thought of it as seeing what others ignored. The moment he saw Mercer step out with Ranger snarling at his side, Brian's pulse quickened. He lifted his phone with shaky hands and tapped the screen to begin streaming live. The lens shook at first, catching only the glare of the cruiser's hood, but then it steadied. "This is real," he whispered, though no one was near enough to hear him. "People need to see." His freckled face burned with both fear and resolve, his thumb hovering as the comments began to roll in almost instantly. Mercer adjusted his grip on Ranger's leash and turned his gaze toward Jasmine's porch. He said nothing yet, but his posture spoke for him. The straight back, the squared shoulders, the narrowed eyes. The heat pressed heavier, cicadas screamed from the trees, and the stillness of Willow Creek cracked under the weight of what was unfolding. Jasmine sat frozen, her arms tightening around Chloe, her breath shallow. Chloe whimpered softly, her face pressed against her mother's chest. Across the street, Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, heart thudding, every instinct telling her something irreversible was about to happen. The neighbors who lingered at their yards watched in silence, their eyes moving between the officer, the dog, and the young mother on the porch. Brian's camera recorded everything, each passing second captured for anyone who cared to look. It was still early, but the ordinary Sunday morning had been broken. The cruiser's crooked presence, the officer's rigid stance, the dog's restless growl, and the boy's steady lens, all of it fused together into a moment the town would not forget. The stage had been set, though none could predict how quickly the tension would ignite. The Sunday heat in Willow Creek pressed down on everything like an unseen weight. Cicadas buzzed from the trees, and the distant hum of an air conditioning unit sputtered from a house across the street. The police cruiser, stark and authoritative with its flashing bar muted in the daylight, still sat idling at the curb in front of Jasmine's rental. Kyle Mercer stood in the yard, boots planted wide, his badge glinting like a challenge under the Georgia sun. He was a man of rigid build, square-shouldered with short brown hair cropped so close it seemed to bristle with his temper. His jawline was tight with suspicion, his pale eyes narrow and cold as he spoke, his voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "You match the description," he barked, his hand resting near the holster of his belt, though no weapon was drawn. "I'll need you to step aside, ma'am." Jasmine's grip around Chloe tightened instinctively. The baby squirmed against her chest, small fists pressing weakly against her mother's skin, but Jasmine held her daughter like a lifeline. Sweat clung to Jasmine's forehead and temples, her natural curls damp and plastered down by the heat. Her eyes, dark and tired from weeks of restless nights, widened with disbelief. "I haven't done anything," she said, her voice trembling but firm in the way a mother clings to defiance for her child's sake. Her thin frame shook as she instinctively took a step back, her bare feet pressing into the cracked wooden porch. Beside Mercer, the German shepherd stirred. Ranger, his once proud coat dulled by the sun and years of service, let out a low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. His ears tilted forward, hackles slightly raised, eyes fixed on Jasmine with a tension that rippled through the leash in Mercer's hand. Yet beneath that sharp canine glare, something flickered, something older, softer. The dog's muscles trembled, not with eagerness to attack, but with confusion, as though he were caught in a battle with his own memory. For a heartbeat, Ranger saw not Jasmine, but another figure entirely. A younger woman, wearing fatigues, crouching low in a field of smoke. Her hands had once wrapped around his head, pressing against his ears to soothe him after an explosion had nearly robbed him of hearing. Her voice, calm and warm, had whispered through the chaos. "It's okay, boy. You're safe. I've got you." That voice echoed in the deepest corners of his mind now, stirring against Mercer's command, creating a fracture in the obedience drilled into him for years. On the porch next door, Eleanor Price sat frozen in her rocking chair, her teacup rattling against its saucer. The elderly widow had weathered decades of life wars seen on television, losses endured in her own family, and the quiet decay of a small town that forgot its neighbors too quickly. Her gray hair, tied into a bun, gleamed with the sweat of the morning. She had been a nurse once, long ago, and though her hands now trembled with arthritis, her heart knew the cadence of danger when she heard it. Her pulse quickened as she saw Mercer's posture, the taut leash, the trembling young mother with a child clutched tight. Eleanor pressed her lips together, her brows knitting into a deep furrow of disapproval, her chest rising and falling with unease. From across the street, curtains shifted. Neighbors emerged, drawn by the hum of the cruiser and the tension spilling into the air like static before a storm. Among them was a tall man with grease-stained hands and a blue mechanic's shirt, Jared Mills, who ran the auto shop down by the main road. He muttered under his breath, wiping sweat off his neck as he joined the small crowd forming at the edge of Jasmine's yard. Others followed, Mrs. Thompson, heavy-set and stern, with a dish rag still in her hand. A pair of young boys who leaned on their bicycles gawking with wide eyes. And at the corner, with a phone raised high, stood Brian, the tech-obsessed teenager who had already begun streaming the confrontation live. The glow of his phone reflected in his glasses, and though his freckled face was pale with nerves, there was a spark of determination in his eyes. This wasn't just about curiosity for him. He had grown up in a world where truth was slippery, where stories changed once they left the mouths of authority. He believed in proof, undeniable, unedited, captured on screen. His viewers were already commenting, their words scrolling fast as if the whole town was watching through his lens. Mercer's voice boomed again, cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. "Step aside, miss. You'll only make this worse." He tugged sharply at Ranger's leash, pulling the dog closer to Jasmine. Ranger's paws dug into the grass, his body stiff, his throat rumbling with another growl. But his eyes, those conflicted amber eyes, shifted again. He looked at Chloe, the baby pressed against Jasmine's chest. He sniffed the air, catching the innocent scent of milk and soap, a smell that cut through the heat and dust. The growl faltered, replaced by a short, confused whine that made a few neighbors glance at one another in surprise. Jasmine's heart pounded. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body knew she couldn't, there was nowhere to go, and her legs shook too hard to carry her. Instead, she met Ranger's gaze. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to reach through the charged silence. "Please, don't let him do this." Whether she was speaking to Mercer or the dog, even she wasn't certain. Ranger's ears twitched. In the cavern of his fractured mind, memory warred with command. He saw Mercer's heavy hand, the harsh training, the pain that came when obedience faltered. Yet he also felt the phantom warmth of another touch, the gentle stroke of a palm across his scarred head, the embrace of safety after chaos. Eleanor leaned forward on her porch, her knuckles white around her teacup. She could feel her heart hammering, her nurse's instincts screaming that something irreversible was about to break. Around her, the crowd grew restless. A whisper passed through them, worry thick as the humid air. For the first time in years, Willow Creek stood still, its people united not by celebration or gossip, but by the silent fear of what a single man and his dog might do to a mother and her child. And in the center of it all, Ranger's growl lingered, caught between past and present, obedience and memory, cruelty and love. The morning air was heavy, though the sun had climbed high and cast its warm light across the narrow street. It should have been an ordinary summer day in the neighborhood, with children pedaling bicycles and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting on the breeze. Instead, the block had become a theater of dread. Jasmine stood frozen near the edge of her small front yard, clutching Chloe so tightly to her chest that the little girl's face pressed into her mother's shoulder. Chloe whimpered, her small frame shivering not from cold, but from terror. Mercer's eyes narrowed as he tightened his grip on the leather leash wrapped twice around his hand. He was a man shaped by authority, his stocky frame filling out his police uniform in a way that spoke less of fitness and more of stubborn mass. His sunburnt skin and deep lines along his brow bore the mark of a man who rarely smiled. Mercer thrived on the intimidation his presence created, the kind of officer who believed fear kept order more than compassion ever could. Beside him, Ranger was restless. The German shepherd's powerful muscles tensed beneath his patchy fur, the faint scars across his ear and muzzle still visible reminders of battles fought when he had once been celebrated as a disciplined K9. But now his amber eyes darted nervously, confusion flickering in their depths. He growled low, torn between the harsh tug of Mercer's leash and the broken fragments of memory buried deep within him. Somewhere inside the animal's scarred mind was the echo of another life, where gentle hands had once soothed his pain instead of dragging him forward like a weapon. Mercer barked an order, his voice loud enough to make bystanders flinch. "Take her, Ranger!" he roared, jerking the leash so hard the dog stumbled forward. Jasmine screamed, backing away as Ranger lunged. The shepherd's jaws clamped around her forearm with crushing force. Pain shot through Jasmine's body. Her knees buckled, but she refused to let go of Chloe. In her desperate twist, Ranger's paw scraped across Chloe's small arm, leaving a red streak where his claws had torn her skin. Chloe's scream pierced the street, a sound so raw it seemed to stop time for an instant. The neighborhood erupted. Eleanor, who had been watching from her porch in her simple blue house dress, let out a strangled cry, both hands flying to her mouth. At 58, she had lived through storms of grief and hardship, her husband's early death, the burden of raising her children alone, but nothing in her life had prepared her for the sight of a child harmed by those sworn to protect. She stumbled down her porch steps, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. All around, other neighbors rushed forward. Mr. Alvarez, a wiry man in his 60s who still wore his old gardening gloves, shouted, "Stop him! That's enough!" His voice cracked with anger. Mrs. Jenkins, a short woman with gray hair tied tightly in a bun, shielded her grandson behind her as if the violence might spill further. Panic rippled like a wave, yet no one dared get too close to Mercer or the snarling dog. Across the street, Brian's phone trembled in his 14-year-old hands. The boy, pale and wiry with shaggy brown hair that often fell into his eyes, had started streaming the confrontation almost instinctively. He lived half his life online, and in his mind, documenting injustice was as vital as breathing. Now, as Ranger's teeth tore into Jasmine's sleeve and blood blossomed across the fabric, Brian's live stream caught every horrifying second. The number of viewers had spiked into the hundreds. Angry comments scrolled across the screen in real time. "What the hell is that cop doing? Get that dog off her. This is abuse. Someone call the news." Brian's own breathing was loud in the microphone, but he kept filming, whispering under his breath, "They're gonna see this. Everyone's gonna see this." Jasmine, her eyes wide with terror, fought back against the animal's weight. She stumbled toward her porch, crying out, "Please stop. She's just a baby." Chloe's shrieks grew hoarse, her tiny fists clinging to her mother's dress as though the fabric itself might save her. Blood smeared Jasmine's arm where Ranger's teeth sank deeper, and tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with sweat and grime. For a fleeting second, Ranger faltered. His ears twitched, and he loosened his grip just enough for Jasmine to wrench free. His gaze caught Chloe's frightened eyes, and something, an echo of another life, flared in his mind. He remembered warmth, the faint scent of antiseptic, a woman's voice humming gently as she stroked his head after surgery. He had once been more than a weapon. The memory was a ghost, fragile and fleeting, but it stayed his bite for a breath. Mercer, however, saw only defiance. His face turned red as he jerked the leash violently. "Finish it," he snarled, his voice carrying across the stunned neighborhood. Ranger snapped back into obedience with a whimper, his instincts at war with his handler's command. He lunged again, though the hesitation in his eyes was clear to anyone who dared look closely. The crowd's reaction swelled. Eleanor shouted, "You're hurting them!" Others cried out in agreement. Phones were lifted, recording from every angle. A sense of collective outrage filled the street. This wasn't just one woman and her child anymore. It was a community witnessing brutality in daylight. At the far end of the block, an old truck rumbled to a stop. Its driver, a tall man in worn jeans and a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, stepped out. His name was Samuel Carter, though most neighbors only knew him as Sam, the quiet veteran who kept to himself at the edge of town. Broad-shouldered with short-cropped hair gone prematurely gray, Sam bore the weary calm of a man who had seen more war than peace. His sharp blue eyes scanned the scene instantly, taking in Jasmine's bloodied arm, Chloe's tears, the dog's conflicted struggle, and the officer's ruthless commands. He didn't rush forward. Years of training told him to observe before acting, but his jaw clenched and his fists curled at his sides. Something deep within him stirred at the sight of Ranger. He knew that face, that scar on the dog's ear. Memories long buried flickered in Sam's mind, uninvited and unstoppable. The neighborhood held its breath. In the harsh glare of sunlight, blood glistened, voices rose, and the live-stream counter climbed higher. What had begun as intimidation had transformed into a public spectacle of cruelty and resistance, one that no one could ever forget. The chaos on Maple Street felt like a thunderclap that wouldn't fade. Neighbors shouted, children cried, and the air was pierced by the helpless wails of little Chloe as blood beaded where Ranger's teeth had grazed her tiny arm. Jasmine's scream still rang in the air when another sound tore through the crowd, a bark, deep, guttural, steady as a drumbeat of command. Atlas charged forward, his old bones moving with surprising speed, his amber eyes locked on Ranger. He wasn't just any German shepherd. His coat, though streaked with gray and dulled by years, still carried the proud pattern of black and tan. His ears, one nicked from an old battle scar, stood high, his muscles taut under thinning fur. This was no pet, no frightened house dog. This was a soldier answering a call. Behind him came Sam Carter. His broad frame cut through the stunned onlookers. Sam was 42, his face lined by desert sun and the sleepless weight of war. His dark hair, cropped close but streaked with premature silver, gleamed in the harsh afternoon light. His jaw was set firm, a scar tracing down from his left temple to the edge of his cheek, a reminder of shrapnel in Kandahar. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and boots that had trudged through both sand and snow, he moved with the unmistakable bearing of a Marine. His voice carried command before his words even formed. "Atlas, hold!" Atlas halted in front of Jasmine and Chloe, his body a barrier of fur and willpower, teeth bared at Ranger. Ranger, torn between his master's tug and some buried fragment of recognition, growled low, but faltered when Atlas squared his stance. The dogs had seen war won in the desert sands, the other trained for streets and suspects, and for a moment they faced each other not as beasts, but as soldiers. Mercer snarled, yanking at Ranger's leash. His arrogance, once a sneer in his tone, now showed cracks under the gaze of Sam Carter. "This is none of your business, Carter," he barked, his knuckles white on the leash, his badge flashing in the sun. Sam's eyes, cold steel beneath the shadow of his brow, met Mercer's. When it comes to kids bleeding in the street, it's everyone's business. The crowd, once scattered, began to draw close. Eleanor stood stiff on her porch, hand pressed against her heart. She wasn't the only one trembling. Beside her, Mr. Howard, the retired school principal with a crooked back and shaking cane, muttered, "That's Sam Carter. Thought he'd never come back after what happened overseas." Whispers ran through the crowd like wildfire stories of Sam, the Marine who had carried 3 men out of a burning convoy. Sam, the man who buried his brother in uniform. Sam, the one who'd left with Atlas and never looked back. Then came the veterans. They arrived not as a rehearsed show, but as if the earth itself had called them. First was Miguel Alvarez, broad-shouldered and limping on a prosthetic leg hidden under khaki trousers. His brown eyes, sharp under a baseball cap, darted from Ranger to Sam. He had once served in the same unit, the bond between them unspoken but etched deep. Then James Whitaker emerged, thin and pale from years of illness, his chest rising with each labored breath, but his spirit was unbroken. And behind them, Clara Jennings, though not a soldier. She had been a medic in Iraq, her short blonde hair tucked behind her ears, her freckled face hardened by things she never forgot. Together they formed a quiet line behind Sam, a living testament of war's shadow walking among the living. Brian, the local streamer, caught it all on his phone. His live stream ticked past 1,000 viewers. Comments scrolled in frantic rhythm. "Why is that cop letting his dog attack a woman? Who's the guy with the shepherd? He looks like he's done this before." And then, "Sam Carter? No way, he's a damn hero." Atlas shifted his stance, teeth still bared, growl vibrating low in his throat. Jasmine, clutching Chloe, whispered broken thanks to Sam. Her eyes wide, tear-streaked face lifted toward him with desperate relief. Sam gave her the faintest nod, his hand steady, palm raised in command not only to Atlas, but to the storm itself. Mercer tried to regain control, puffing out his chest. "This woman matches the suspect's description. She's hiding something. Ranger did what he was trained to do." His voice cracked slightly, just enough for those close enough to hear. Sam took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Then why's she the one bleeding and screaming while your dog shakes in confusion?" He gestured subtly toward Ranger, whose ears flickered at Atlas's steady glare. For the first time, Mercer hesitated. The veterans behind Sam murmured, their presence pressing against Mercer's bravado. Miguel leaned on his cane and said loudly enough for the crowd, "Man, I've seen Sam stare down worse than this in a desert storm." You think he's gonna blink here? The crowd buzzed with agreement, their faith shifting like a tide. Eleanor, who had once crossed the street to avoid Mercer's shadow, found her voice rising. We all saw what happened. She didn't provoke it. That officer did. For Ranger, the world spun differently. The leash burned against his neck, but Atlas's eyes, those old amber embers, pulled at something long buried. A memory flashed, a hand not of Mercer's, but gentler, bandaging his paw once. The scent of fear and comfort intertwined, a girl's voice maybe, or the warmth of a stranger's touch in some forgotten corner of his life. His growl faltered. Mercer tugged harder, enraged at the betrayal. "Ranger, attack!" he commanded, but Atlas stepped forward with a snarl so deep it rolled like thunder, silencing the street. Even Mercer staggered back, his grip shaking. The livestream audience erupted in capital letters, outrage pouring faster than the comments could be read. "Suspend that cop! Protect the woman and child! Sam Carter is the only one with guts here." For one frozen moment, the weight of two worlds collided, the authority of a crooked badge against the quiet honor of a soldier and his old comrade. And in that moment, the crowd chose. Eleanor did not hesitate. Her hands trembled, but her movements were precise, instinctive. She rushed forward, her gray cardigan fluttering as if tugged by the weight of the chaos surrounding her. Her face, lined with years of quiet resilience and the shadows of long hospital shifts, glistened with sweat though the morning sun was still mild. She scooped Chloe from Jasmine's arms, whispering soft, steady words as she pressed the girl to her chest. Chloe's small cries broke against Eleanor's shoulder, the sound mingling with the rising wave of outrage from the neighbors. Eleanor's training as a nurse had carved reflex into muscle. She crouched by the porch steps, checking the child's skin where Ranger's claw had grazed her, wrapping the wound with the small cloth she tore from her own sleeve. Her hands shook, not from inexperience but from fear, a memory flashing of her own brother lost years ago because no one had stepped in quickly enough. Atlas stood like a statue forged in defiance, his coat black and tan but dulled with age, scars glimmering faintly in the light. His amber eyes burned into Ranger, who trembled, not from lack of strength but from the tug of something older than Mercer's leash, a memory buried deep. He remembered warmth once, a pair of arms cradling him when he was a pup, voices that were not commands but lullabies. His growl wavered, a rumble that spoke of a conflict inside him, a battle between loyalty twisted by training and a yearning for the comfort of something lost. Sam placed a firm hand on Atlas's neck, grounding his old partner while his other hand extended outward as though to shield the crowd. His broad frame, hardened by years in the Marines, now bore the posture of someone unwilling to yield, not to Mercer, not to violence, not to the shadow of fear tightening its grip on the block. His voice was low but carried weight. "This stops now," he growled. Brian, the local troublemaker with greasy hair slicked back and an unshaven jaw, spun his phone toward his own pale, sweating face. "They're letting the dog attack a child!" His voice cracked with a mixture of excitement and opportunism. He didn't care about Chloe's cries. He cared about the numbers climbing in the corner of his screen. Behind him, his battered denim jacket caught the light, while his thin lips twisted into the smirk of a man who had discovered his currency in chaos. Within minutes, his live stream exploded, comments pouring in like fuel to a fire, furious words scrolling faster than his eyes could follow. "Monsters in uniform! Protect the baby! Where's the justice?" The crowd's murmurs turned to roars as people pulled out their own phones, recording, amplifying. Eleanor lifted her head, voice breaking through the swell. "She's bleeding, Mercer. She's a child." The words were not just for the officer, but for the entire street, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had patched too many wounds and buried too many regrets. Her hair, streaked with silver, clung to her damp forehead as she glanced at Jasmine, who stood frozen, face pale, lips trembling, unable to shake the image of Ranger's teeth so close to her daughter's skin. Jasmine's neighbor, old Mr. Dalton, shuffled forward with his cane, a retired postal worker, his back stooped but his voice still sharp as rusted iron. "We know Jasmine. She ain't no criminal. You think we don't see what you're doing, Mercer?" His words struck like kindling to the crowd's fire, his wrinkled hand pointing accusingly. Mercer's face twisted, jaw tightening as sweat beaded beneath his cap. His uniform was crisp, badge polished, yet his posture betrayed unease under the weight of so many watching eyes. Ranger's growl faltered again, and Mercer yanked the leash, trying to drag obedience from confusion. "Control yourself," he snapped, but his voice wavered, betrayed by the cracks spreading through his authority. A young woman in the crowd, Sarah Jennings, a kindergarten teacher with warm brown skin and dark curls pulled into a tight bun, clutched her tote bag to her chest. She had always been timid in public disputes, but now her voice quivered with boldness. "You almost killed her." Her eyes shone with unshed tears, her thoughts flashing to her own students, to their fragile hands gripping crayons. She stepped closer, her floral skirt brushing against the knees of children gathering behind her. Sam's fellow veterans began to close in. Eric Monroe, tall and lean with the restless energy of a man who had seen too much desert, crossed his arms. "Back off, Mercer," he said with a flat calm that carried menace. To his left, Curtis Daniels, broader and slower in movement but steady as a wall, planted himself between Jasmine and the officer. Their silent solidarity made the street feel less like a neighborhood and more like a line of defense, a front line drawn not against a foreign threat, but against a corruption festering in their own soil. Brian's phone shook as the comments boiled over. People across the country were sharing, tagging, demanding accountability, the stream filled with hearts, tears, curses. "Is this America? Somebody stop that cop! Where's child services?" The moment had slipped beyond Mercer's control, carried on digital wings faster than any command he could bark. Ranger's eyes flickered again, caught by Atlas's steady gaze. For a breath, the world stilled, the crowd, the phones, the shouting all dimming. Ranger's ears twitched, his hackles easing just slightly as if reaching for the phantom of the kindness he once knew. Atlas did not move forward, did not attack. He simply stood, an elder soldier staring down a younger one, saying without words, "You can choose." Then Chloe whimpered softly against Eleanor's shoulder, her small hand clutching the nurse's cardigan, smearing it with her tears. That sound, pure and broken, snapped the street into motion again. The crowd roared louder. Eleanor called for ice. Sam planted his boots more firmly. And Mercer, his grip tightening on the leash, looked around and realized he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted, cornered not by teeth but by voices, by truth swelling into something unstoppable. Sam Carter stood tall, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the crowd's fury, the heat of the afternoon sun painting his face with a sheen of sweat. His voice carried over the hush that had fallen, a voice molded by years of battlefield commands but now softened by outrage and compassion. "You just let your dog attack an innocent child, Mercer." The words rang like a gavel. The crowd, no longer whispering but emboldened, erupted in a chorus of boos and shouts. Faces burned with indignation, and fists shook in the air. The weight of Willow Creek had shifted, and the man who had once commanded fear now stood isolated in its glare. Mercer's eyes darted wildly, his composure cracking. The stocky, barrel-chested man had always relied on intimidation, his crisp police uniform worn like armor, his square jaw a mask of authority. But now, beads of sweat ran down his temple, his hands trembling slightly as the leash went slack. Ranger, once his tool of menace, stood frozen at the edge of the square. The German shepherd's chest heaved, his amber eyes unfocused, caught between the pull of memory and the bark of command. In those eyes flickered the echo of another time, a gentle hand, a warm voice, the fleeting comfort of kindness. His paws shuffled in the dust as if he could step backward into the safety of the past. Atlas moved forward, his black and tan fur shimmering like burnished steel in the noon light. Age had curved his back slightly, the faint scar along his flank a badge of survival, but his presence was unwavering. He let out a guttural growl that vibrated in the air, pushing Mercer instinctively back a step. The leash jerked uselessly, Mercer's hand no longer commanding. The crowd gasped as if seeing not just a dog but a force of nature rise against cruelty itself. Eleanor, who had knelt in the dirt with Chloe still trembling in her arms, straightened now, her nurse's uniform wrinkled and streaked with dust. She raised her voice with unexpected authority, honed from years of demanding silence in hospital wards during emergencies. "Enough," she cried. "This child could have died, and we all saw who gave the order." Her gray hair, pinned into a bun, framed a face lined with years of care and quiet resilience, and now those lines deepened with righteous fury. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, coalescing into angry declarations. "He's unfit for duty," someone shouted. "Endangering a baby," another bellowed. A voice carried clear above the rest Brian, his phone still clutched in his sweaty hand, live streaming every second. Thousands are watching this right now. The world knows what Mercer did. The feed exploded with comments lines of furious text scrolling faster than the eye could catch, each one a blow to Mercer's crumbling authority. At that moment, a new figure stepped through the wall of townsfolk, a young man, his stride purposeful, his jaw taut with resolve. Officer Daniel Ruiz, fresh from the academy, barely into his mid-20s. He was lean, his navy uniform crisp, the badge catching sunlight with almost symbolic brilliance. His hair was cut short, dark and neat, his brown eyes sharp but untested by long years of service. He had been quiet in the weeks since his transfer to Willow Creek, cautious in the shadow of Mercer's dominance, but now he moved with clarity. He placed a steadying hand on Sam's shoulder, his touch a signal not just of solidarity, but of a torch being passed. "This ends here," Daniel said, his voice steady, clear enough for the microphones of dozens of streaming phones. "I will file my report. I will testify. The people of Willow Creek deserve the truth." A cheer rolled through the crowd like thunder, surging against the fragile dam of Mercer's authority. Mercer's lips moved, fumbling for words, but his voice failed him. The sight of his younger subordinate standing tall, side by side with Sam, with Atlas growling at his heel, broke something in him. His posture sagged, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He looked smaller now, diminished beneath the relentless sun. Ranger whimpered, lowering his head as if ashamed. For the first time, Mercer tried to tug the leash back gently, but the shepherd did not move. His defiance was not rebellion, but a return to something older, something purer. He took a hesitant step closer to Atlas, his ears twitching, torn between the two worlds that defined him, loyalty to command and the longing for kindness. Near the back of the crowd, an older man leaned on his cane, his eyes misted with both age and conviction. This was Walter Griggs, a retired judge who had lived in Willow Creek his entire life. Known for his tall, stooped frame and piercing blue eyes, he rarely left his home since his wife's passing. But today, drawn by the uproar, he had shuffled into the square. Now he lifted his trembling hand and pointed at Mercer. "Justice isn't blind, son. We all saw what you did." His voice, though cracked by time, carried the weight of decades of judgment. The crowd hushed for a moment, letting the words settle like a verdict. Mercer's knees bent slightly, as though the ground itself had grown heavy beneath him. His knuckles whitened around the leash, but no command came. Sam stepped closer, Atlas keeping pace, the unity of man and dog like a shadow of battles long past. His eyes burned into Mercer's. "You don't own this town anymore. You don't even own that dog. Look at him, he's telling you himself." The silence that followed was broken only by the fluttering of a flag in the summer breeze and the ragged breathing of a man losing the last of his power. Ranger turned his gaze from Mercer to Atlas, then to Sam, as though weighing the souls of men against one another. The decision lingered like a storm about to break. The sound of sirens faded into the hot afternoon air as the ambulance carrying Jasmine and little Chloe rolled out of Willow Creek's narrow street. Neighbors who had once only waved politely at each other now lingered, drawn together by the storm of events that had shaken their quiet town. News crews had begun arriving, their cameras catching the raw aftermath, splintered emotions, the sudden fall of a man once untouchable, and the rise of something more enduring community. Inside the ambulance, Chloe whimpered, but her small fingers clutched tightly at Jasmine's shirt, refusing to let go. The attending paramedic, Maria Thompson, a middle-aged woman with short-cropped silver hair and a calm voice seasoned from years in the field, reassured Jasmine. Maria had the no-nonsense air of someone who had seen the worst yet never lost her empathy. "She's lucky," she murmured, gently examining Chloe's small arm where Ranger's tooth had grazed her. "Just a surface wound. A scar maybe, but nothing time won't soften. She'll heal." Jasmine, pale and shaken, pressed a trembling kiss to her daughter's forehead. Across town, the ripples spread quickly. The live stream, now replayed thousands of times, showed Mercer's face frozen in disbelief as his own dog had faltered, refusing his command. Local news anchors seized on the moment. Headlines carried his disgrace before he had even finished writing his official report. In the police station, Captain Leonard Reeves, a stout man in his 50s with thinning hair and a reputation for stubborn fairness, called Mercer into his office. Leonard was not a man easily swayed by public opinion, but even he could not ignore the tide. "You put a child in danger," Leonard said, his voice low and firm. Mercer, sweat staining his collar, tried to argue, but the words fell hollow. Hours later, a notice of suspension landed on his desk, stripped of badge and power. Meanwhile, Sam Carter stood outside the ambulance bay, Atlas sitting loyally by his side, chest broad, grizzled muzzle lifted with quiet dignity. Atlas had fought battles overseas, but this standing guard over a town rediscovering its conscience felt heavier. When Ranger, once fierce and mechanical in his obedience, was brought to him, the contrast between the two German shepherds struck everyone watching. Ranger, still strong-bodied at 6 but trembling, lowered his head as though carrying invisible chains. Sam crouched, meeting the dog's amber eyes. "You're free now, boy," he said, and Atlas, as if understanding, leaned forward to sniff Ranger, a silent acceptance between veterans of different wars. Eleanor stepped forward next, Chloe nestled in her arms. The nurse's uniform had been replaced by a simple sundress, her auburn hair tied back in a neat bun, but her presence carried the same authority as in the chaos earlier. She looked at Ranger, then back at Chloe, who reached out her tiny hand despite the sting of the bandage. "See? Even she forgives," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying more weight than any sermon. Soon the town gathered around Jasmine's small, weather-worn house at the end of Willow Creek Road. Its porch sagged, paint peeled, and shutters hung askew. For years, it had stood as a quiet reminder of Jasmine's struggles, her late husband's absence, the bills that piled faster than her paycheck, the loneliness that clung like ivy to the walls. But that evening, hammers rang and laughter rolled as men and women carried lumber, paint cans, and casseroles. Among them was Hank Douglas, a broad-shouldered carpenter with calloused hands, who barked instructions with gruff good humor. "That porch will stand longer than the rest of us when I'm done," he promised, and though his voice was rough, his actions were gentle, fixing the steps so Chloe could safely climb them. Children from the neighborhood ran about, chasing each other, occasionally pausing to pet Atlas or timidly stroke Ranger, who was slowly learning that touch could mean kindness instead of command. Sam worked alongside them, sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking down his temples. For the first time since returning from service, he didn't feel like an outsider haunting the edges of his hometown. He belonged. And Jasmine, watching from the doorway, felt the sharp edges of her fear soften into something she had almost forgotten: hope. Later, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and gold, Brian appeared, phone still in hand, though for once not live streaming. The lanky young man with a restless energy seemed different now, chastened by the gravity of what he had captured. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Jasmine, Sam, I thought you should know. That video, it's everywhere. People aren't just angry at Mercer, they're moved. They're calling Chloe the brave little angel of Willow Creek." Jasmine's breath caught, but Sam laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. "She's not just a symbol," he said firmly. "She's a child who deserves to grow up safe." Brian nodded, for once silent, realizing some truths could not be packaged into content. As night settled, a lantern-lit vigil formed in the newly mended yard. People shared stories of resilience of wars fought, losses endured, and kindnesses remembered. Eleanor spoke of patients who had no families, and how Chloe reminded her that sometimes the whole town must become family. Daniel Ruiz, the young officer with dark curls and earnest eyes, stood tall and vowed that Willow Creek's police force would change, that power would no longer protect corruption. Ranger lay curled beside Atlas, not as rivals but as brothers, their breathing steady in the warm summer night. Chloe, her hair tousled and cheeks still damp with the remnants of tears, toddled between them, her small arms wrapping around their thick necks. Someone snapped a picture, a simple, fleeting moment. By dawn, it had traveled across screens worldwide, a child in a red dress between two German shepherds, flanked by neighbors whose shadows stretched long with unity. It was called many things: the heart of Willow Creek, a family made of many, the dogs who taught us. But to those who were there, it was simply the night their town remembered how to stand together. And for Jasmine, Sam, Atlas, Ranger, and Chloe, it was the beginning of something fragile yet fiercely alive, a family not bound by blood, but by choice, courage, and the belief that even the deepest wounds could heal under the steady light of compassion. In the end, this story is not only about Jasmine, Chloe, Sam, Atlas, and Ranger, it is about all of us. When a community comes together, when love replaces fear, and when forgiveness heals old wounds, it feels like a glimpse of God's hand at work. Some would call it luck, but many know it as a miracle. An everyday reminder that the Lord still moves among us through acts of courage, compassion, and unity. In our daily lives, we may not face the same storms as Willow Creek, but we do face moments where kindness can change everything. A helping hand, a word of encouragement, a prayer spoken in faith. These are the little miracles God gives us to share with one another. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and let your voice join ours in a prayer for families, for children, and for every soul in need of love. Type Amen in the comments as a blessing for Chloe, for Atlas and Ranger, and for everyone watching, that God's grace may continue to protect and guide us all. May the Lord bless you and keep you always.